In the late 1970s and early 1980s, tabletop role-playing was primarily a game of extraction. Player characters operated as heavily armed apex predators, delving into subterranean spaces with one main objective: extract as much wealth as physically possible. This era was dominated by the town and dungeon wargaming philosophy. Adventurers rested in safe settlements, then ventured into mazes where enemies rarely hunted. Instead, monsters waited inside isolated geometric rooms, existing passively until players kicked down the door. The turning point occurred during a typical dungeon crawl when creators Tracy and Laura Hickman encountered a vampire. The creature hadn't been placed there for a specific story reason. It was generated by a random encounter table. Reducing a legendary creature of gothic romance to a generic wandering obstacle highlighted a flaw in the game's design. The mechanics of the era excelled at tactical combat, but they struggled to generate true psychological tension. The Hickmans spent 5 years playtesting a solution to this stagnation, which culminated in the 1983 release of the adventure module I6 Ravenloft. They brought with them a strict design manifesto that inverted the table's power dynamic. They built a system where the players were no longer the predators, but the desperate prey. By integrating literary tropes into the rules themselves, the module provided a structural blueprint for suspense that had previously been missing from the hobby's most popular systems. The trap begins the moment the characters enter the Valley of Barovia. A magically poisoned fog seals off the borders behind them. If a player attempts to turn back and breathe the outside air, the poison activates, preventing any early escape. By trapping the party inside the valley, the module devalues traditional game rewards. When you can't reach a town to spend your extracted gold, your primary motivation shifts towards survival and the protection of the valley's inhabitants. To enforce this survival dynamic, the adventure introduced Count Strahd von Zarovich. Rather than waiting in the final room of the maze, Strahd is a dynamic adversary who actively stalks the players throughout the castle. This chart shows why a first-edition vampire was so terrifying. Every physical hit from Strahd permanently drops the player's power level. Reversing that damage required a restoration spell, which aged the casting cleric by 2 years of their life. Knowing this, Strahd avoids fighting to the death. The module provides explicit hit-and-run instructions. He utilizes secret doors, regenerates his health, and summons swarms of zombies to slowly exhaust the party's resources before retreating into the shadows. By combining constant resource attrition with an active, stalking threat, the adventure successfully translates the emotional dread of a gothic horror novel into hard, unforgiving mathematics. The physical space itself acts as a mechanical tool. David C. Sutherland III drafted the maps to induce spatial claustrophobia and vertical tension. This three-dimensional complexity hindered the standard two-dimensional graph paper mapping tactics that players of the era relied upon to feel oriented. To ensure the module remained unpredictable, it introduced the Fortunes of Ravenloft, a procedural generation system using a standard deck of playing cards. Drawing these cards dynamically assigned the locations of vital artifacts and dictated exactly where the final villain encounter would take place. This randomization destroyed the safety of predictability. The Dungeon Master was forced to navigate the adventure blindly, experiencing the discovery of the unknown alongside the players. Pushing these design boundaries sparked scholarly criticism. By forcing players into an inescapable valley with a predefined objective, historians argue Ravenloft introduced the railroad concept, which traded the open freedom of early sandbox games for a fixed narrative path. There is also an ongoing debate about the DM's pet syndrome. Giving a villain explicit plot armor and constant escape tactics risks frustrating players by robbing them of a straightforward, earned victory. The module also shows signs of its era through ludo-narrative dissonance. High fantasy tropes like fire-breathing red dragons and sword-eating rust monsters are placed inside a moody, gothic vampire's castle. Yet the module's aesthetic footprint was massive. The iconic cover art was even blatantly traced for the North American box of the 1987 Nintendo game, Castlevania II. These friction points prove how effectively the adventure was pushing against the rigid boundaries of early game design. The massive success of the module provided Tracy Hickman with the momentum to launch Project Overlord, a series of connected adventures known as the Dragonlance Saga. This shift toward a singular, overarching plot established the production model for the multi-volume campaign sagas that define the modern tabletop industry. The 1983 release rescued the monster from the indignity of randomized encounter tables and placed it at the center of a cohesive psychological architecture. The halls of Ravenloft stand as evidence that a series of encounters can function as a cohesive narrative. It demonstrated that a game built on wargaming roots was capable of achieving the weight and complexity of a literary tragedy.